Yeah. I'm saying you gotta do this.
No.
Got to call the meeting to order. Can I have a roll call, please?
Mayor Napolitani,
Here.
Council members Achara,
Here.
and Weinstein.
Here.
Councilwoman Kaplan will be here shortly. Can we stand as we have a pledge allegiance to the flag and remain standing as we do a silent prayer? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Please remain standing. You may be seated. The notice requirements of the Open Public Meetings Act for this meeting have been satisfied, and a copy of the annual of the special meeting notice was sent to the Asbury Park Press and the Coaster posted in Town Hall, filed in the office of the municipal clerk on January 3rd, 2025. There are 2 emergency exits to the right that will take you to the front of the building, and 1 to the left that will take you to the rear of the building. Please make sure all your cell phones are turned off, and if you need to make a call, kindly step outside to make the call. We have 1 item for discussion this evening, and then we're going to turn this over to New Jersey Fish, Game and Wildlife regarding deer management. So the first item for discussion is D1, which is a flag request. So we received a flag request from Garden State Equality for Gay Pride Weekend from May 31st to June 2nd. So open for discussion. I believe Councilman Aseri had some concerns or
We had
modifications to
not
the
this.
existing
Yes.
modifications to the existing.
Correct. So given that
Yep.
modification of the existing resolution. So given that this was placed well before, well, it's already in, that's fine.
Yep.
I believe we discussed this at a previous meeting where we said that we would like to have any applicants be residents of Ocean Township that would apply for it. So that didn't happen. We didn't create a resolution, but if we all agree to that, we can have Jesse draw that up so that we don't have people from out of state, out of country coming in and because we got a flag. And I get we can say no at any time, but it would probably be more effective and more representative of Ocean Township if we can have just our residents applying for a application.
I agree with that.
Okay.
I think it makes a lot of sense.
I would probably think Councilwoman Kaplan would probably agree, and Deputy Mayor Fisher. So the only thing I would say is let's maybe call them when Deputy Mayor's back. Councilwoman Kaplan will be here, so we can run that past her, and then I don't have a problem with getting that on the agenda for the 12th of June.
Sounds like a plan.
Okay. Any other questions, comments, concerns?
Nope.
Let's go down the way. Are you good with the flag?
I am definitely good with the flag.
Yes.
Councilman? I am as well. So that passes for Gay Pride Weekend, which will be next weekend in Asbury Park. So with that being said, I am going to turn this over, and I believe we have Brian Schum. Is that a Schum? From Fish, Game, and Wildlife, and he's here to give a presentation on deer management. Now, just so everyone that's out here in the audience and anybody who's listening or who will be viewing the tape at some point, there have been numerous discussions on deer management in the municipality. And honestly, this is a situation where my personal belief is that the town is completely split in half as to what we should do. We know there's a major issue. We also know that the surrounding municipalities have not done any deer management. We are literally probably one of the only towns that's discussing this because we know the severity of what's gone on over the years with the growing deer population. This is not easy for this council. I need everybody to understand that we do not take this discussion lightly because it is a split in the town. I really wish it was a more of a situation where it was skewed one way and not the other, but this is why we wanted Fish, Game, and Wildlife to come in here and educate us on what we can potentially do if we do anything. So with that being said, I'm going to turn this over to Brian, and if you could, kindly give us what you're going to show that you're doing for deer management. Oh, here, Brian.
You need a mic. Yeah.
I think you need the mic, yeah. Definitely think it's better. Here, don't push that button.
Don't push the button. All right.
Make sure it's always green.
Would you guys mind if I stood here?
Yeah.
Or am I kind of in the way? I guess I'm sort of in the way. I could probably get over. How's that? Not blocking anybody. All right. So I'm Brian Shum. I'm with New Jersey Division of Fish and Wildlife. I'm a senior deer biologist, and I'm an outreach deer biologist. So I specialize in coming to communities and talking about deer management. And let me grab my clicker. Got to hold two things. So just to preface this presentation, ultimately the goal of this presentation is to give everyone in the room the tools to understand why Fish and Wildlife makes the recommendations that it does. And so we're going to do a little crash course on deer biology so that everyone can make their own informed decisions, but so that we're also all speaking the same language. We're all thinking about the same issues, the same concepts, and hopefully everyone at least leaves here more informed about the decision-making process. So, what informs deer management decisions? In New Jersey, and really in any more populated areas, we're always considering human health, ecosystem health, and public feedback. And so it is kind of a departure from like what I thought about when I went to college for ecology. I really thought it was, really strictly about the critters themselves. And the reality of that is that in New Jersey we live in a mosaic where people are living right next to wildlife. We have the most densely populated state, and that comes with a lot of human-wildlife conflict. So when we're thinking about human health concerns, we're thinking about a lot of the things that you guys are experiencing on a near daily basis in this township, which is deer vehicle collisions, tick-borne. You can squeeze around, doesn't there? And that's my colleague Megan Mills. She's the northern region deer biologist, so she's your local one. Whether or not we want to define Monmouth always as North Jersey, we can discuss that another time. But so yeah, again, deer vehicle collisions, tick-borne diseases, and other deer-related diseases. A big one currently, especially with climate change being a consistent topic in politics, a consistent topic for our local parks, we're thinking about the plant growth impacts that deer can have, the loss of biodiversity, namely in plants, but the plant composition directly impacts insect composition, and it directly impacts like our songbirds and all of these other rare and endangered species that rely on habitat. Deer are a keystone species, meaning that they have a disproportionate effect on their environment because of the role they play as these large herbivores, and the spread of invasive diseases. And am I correct that I'm slotted for 25 minutes? Okay. We'll move quick. And then public feedback.
A little more. You can have a little more.
Okay.
26, 27.
27? 27. All right, we're shooting for 27.
I concur.
Nobody knows when we started, so it's potentially infinite. And public feedback. So that's a picture of a soybean farmer who excluded a small portion of his farm. You can see how deer are having a tremendous impact outside of the fence. That would not be obvious without that exclosure present. And I didn't mention, all of this, a central theme is also a desire to live alongside this neighbor of ours, the deer. So we should not forget that at all during this conversation. So in college we learn these terms. There's a social carrying capacity and then there's biological carrying capacity. In some ways I wish I switched the order that I described these, but the social carrying capacity is those things that I just mentioned: human health, ecosystem health, and public feedback. And it's really just us as humans having this conversation in this room and many rooms around the state and deciding what we can tolerate, deciding what harm can be defined as, and having these difficult discussions. Whereas the biological carrying capacity is simply just the number of animals that we can cram into like a square mile. And so You could think about that a little bit more complicatedly and think about what is sustainable to host in a given area, again, with deer being a keystone species. But ultimately, we're thinking about this as the social carrying capacity, because we're humans in the room talking about, deer are obviously able to exist at a higher level from a biological carrying capacity than the social carrying capacity. So, what factors limit the deer population size? If we, can perceive that we're having these deer impacts, and it appears that we might be above that social carrying capacity, what actually is limiting the deer population size? And we're going to go through some biological terms here. The goal basically is, again, get people on the same page about what do we even have to work with when it comes to modifying deer populations. These are the things that you'd have to think through. So on one side of the equation, you have birthing and development rates. So that's fecundity, the number of offspring that they have in a given litter, the gestation period, how long it takes for one to be born, reproductive seasonality, sexual maturation. And of these things, fecundity is the only thing that we can affect. And namely, that would be things like birth control. So that is theoretically something that we could do. The other items on that list, when it comes to birthing and development rates, are, we're really getting into fuzzy territory if we start thinking about. So we're going to table the fecundity idea. So then we have survival rates. So we have natural deaths and human-caused deaths, and this is going to balance our sheet between births and deaths, and that's ultimately the number of deer that we're experiencing on a day-to-day basis. So for natural deaths, we just have dying of old age, dying of disease, and of predation. And again, one of those is more obviously reasonable to consider being predation, and I'm looping in human predation in that, although I have human cause right there. So, and then we have vehicle collisions for human caused, and lethal removal, so human predation. And so, once again, we're not going to hit more of them with our vehicles to reduce the population, so we have intentional human removal of the critters. And then, kind of moving on, the last couple things are immigration and emigration. That's just natural dispersal rates. We can affect that by trapping and relocating animals. So again, these are kind of our four things. Fecundity affecting birth control rates, predation, lethal removal, and then trapping and relocating deer. These are theoretically sensible, things that we can affect. And so really the remainder of the conversation, the remainder of this presentation is looking at which of these four rates are reasonable for Ocean Township, reasonable for your municipality. That's the meat of the conversation. So, and I didn't mention it before, if I'm losing anybody, just raise a hand, either council or people. Take clarifying questions now. We'll get into the meat and potato of questions after the presentation. So, in no real order, these are, of the things we just discussed, these are the management options that we're left with. If we agree that we have an overpopulation of deer, which is something we could also debate, these are our options. And so this is really what I want everyone in the room to understand, these complicated decisions that go into these things. So first off, kind of the easiest one to get rid of is animal predators. So there are people that advocate for like releasing wolves back into New Jersey, releasing mountain lions back into New Jersey. That's not even that complicated on a state level, but let alone we're talking about Ocean Township here. So these are, these conversations are not super helpful or relevant here. It obviously complicates wildlife conflicts that we're going to have. We're talking about wildlife conflicts, and adding more of these large mammals would complicate those things. So we can move on pretty quickly. The next easiest one to get rid of is trapping and relocating, and that's mostly from us as a biologist standpoint, why this one's really unreasonable, but we do have some reasons why it's unreasonable from your perspective as well. So, as a pro, it certainly does have more animal rights group support. That's always the first thing we get asked. Well, can't we just put them somewhere else? We have too many here. Surely there's somewhere else that doesn't have too many. And that's actually very hard to find, a place in New Jersey that wants more deer. We see these deer-human conflicts statewide. You have tremendous densities of deer in most areas of the state. But a big one, really the biggest one, why the state would not, we as the state, would not issue any permits, why it's illegal to move live cervids, live deer species across state lines, is for the transmission of deer-to-deer diseases. So the biggest one, just to be brief, is chronic wasting disease. If you've heard of mad cow disease, this is chronic wasting disease is specific to deer. It's in many states. It's in Pennsylvania. It's in New York. It's not in New Jersey. We don't want it. We're not moving deer around. That's the short of it. And so obviously from the township's perspective and from a taxpayer's perspective, it's tremendously expensive to somehow trap, capture deer, and then humanely move them to a new habitat that they're unfamiliar with. There's also pretty hefty unintended mortality rates associated with this. So again, that's a bit of a theme here when we're thinking about these ways to get around lethal management. There's often these unintended lethal consequences to these animals. So this is much more relevant. This is probably the hottest debate right now, is birth control. How effective is birth control in an open population? So again, it has large animal rights group support, people that would rather humans have no impact on wildlife. This is the next closest thing in terms of a hands-off approach. And it does have high control. You know, as much money as we want to throw at it, we could get more results. There's a lot of issues with birth control. So one, it requires capture, and so again, for brevity of time, there's something called capture myopathy, and so it's just the unintended death of an animal, in this case a deer, after you capture it. For deer, in rigorous studies that actually follow deer about a month out after being captured and something's done with them, it's about a 5 to 10% death rate for those animals just from the stress. It's a bit complicated, but so there's this unintended lethality to it. It's really long time scales. Again, this is kind of complicated population dynamics, but ultimately we're talking about attrition when we're talking about birth control, because if you think about that balance sheet, if you haven't removed any animals, all you're doing is applying some sort of fertility control. You still that next year have the same number of animals that you began with. However, you have less birth rates, and let's pretend like you're at 100%. You've gotten every single doe within your jurisdiction, so you have 100% fertility control for that population. You're still waiting for that overpopulated population to get hit by those cars, to, bless you, to all these, the various ways that they get killed in Ocean Township. A really complicated factor in this is that it really has not been demonstrated to work at all in an open population. That's where the immigration and emigration rates really become an issue, is that the deer in your neighboring townships, and even if you went to a county-wide program, which would be a multi-million-dollar program for this, you still are going to have deer that are looking for that slightly less dense area that they can live in to reduce their deer versus deer competition for resources. So immigration is constant, and the only times that birth control has really been shown to have any significant effect is on islands where there's not deer coming in. So it's very inefficient. Some studies have shown in marginally open populations where, it's like a city, like a 20% decline in the population after like 5-6 years. But you're talking, thousands and thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. In the case of Staten Island, obviously a much larger municipality, they're at about the $7-8 million mark for that project. So, it's very costly, but again, you have high control. If you want to keep throwing money at it, you want to keep trying to capture deer, you will get some marginal results. So now I guess we'll sort of explore the logical fallacy behind once you capture a deer, if the ultimate goal is to reduce the population, it's a bit illogical to release that deer back out, where it can be hit by a car, it can be hosting ticks, and all of these things that we're having these issues with. And then there's obviously the questions about if that's even humane or not to be doing that. But in general, lethal management has the general public's support, and I think it's valuable to consider taking a step back at like a longer history scale. Is that this is a very new conversation that lethal management is potentially wrong, potentially inappropriate. I would say the last 75 years is the first time in probably 14,000 years that deer were not hunted where we're standing right here. So deer have always, by humans. So deer have been managed by humans for food, but also for protection of crops, for thousands and thousands of years. And so really this modern relationship we have with these neighboring deer is very, very new. This is a very new conversation, and one that I find exciting. But in general, we have high public support for sustainable, consumptive use of that resource. And then certainly if we compare to the other ones, it's obviously going to be more efficient because you're not releasing the animals back out, so you're going to have more immediate results. You have, again, the high control that you do with these other human-instigated measures, and it provides local food, and it's comparatively much more inexpensive. So that is ultimately why we recommend lethal management as step number one whenever we're talking about a population scale, overabundance of deer. And then obviously here, I think the biggest ones that we're going to be considering as the potential cons for this are the requirement for land management coordination. So it's locals in a town that are used to not seeing a hunter out in the woods and getting used to the concept that they are. So it takes land managers taking precautions and working. It would be us working together to make those precautions so that the public feels safe. And then of course it lacks the animal rights group support, which is not something that we're really here to resolve today. If it's a very respectful opinion to not want to to view them as really precious wildlife and not want to have that human impact. But I think we would recognize that it's more of a minority. I think it's 97% of Americans eat meat, so I think everyone's coming at this with some context for this human interaction with wildlife. So I want to take a step back and consider what it would look like if we did management without a population reduction. So is it possible at this stage in where the deer population is locally to not have some sort of effect on the population? And so, again, trying to be brief because I have not been paying attention to my time.
You can keep going.
I'm about to be over, unless you count the flag salute. So there's a study that looked at all of these methods to reduce deer vehicle collisions, and just to skip over this, really fencing was the only one they found to have any success. But the point I want to make is that consider that if the only thing you do is reduce deer vehicle collisions, well, that's the highest rate of mortality for deer in your municipality. It's not predation. You have a few coyotes, but it's not going to be predation. There's no human management. So reducing deer vehicle collisions is going to increase, at least on a theoretical level, it has a high probability of increasing your other negative impacts with deer because you're now increasing the population size. So again, if we're thinking about just our forest health, fencing exposures, again, this might be something I might suggest to like a local gardener to fence their garden, but again, just to be brief, it increases, anytime you fence deer out of one area, you're effectively increasing the population density of the surrounding areas. So you're really not being necessarily a good neighbor, even thinking as a municipality or as maybe a slightly larger property owner. If all you're doing is protecting your own property, those deer have to meet their minimum nutrition needs. And so it's, at worst, with enough fences, at the most effective, I guess I would say, you're going to be really declining the health of the animals that we feel like we're helping by not doing these lethal methods. And repellents is another conversation. It doesn't really work. And I think, honestly, I think we could probably wrap up here. I think this is more of a conversation about with your community's leadership about what style of lethal management you might want to look at. So we can certainly explore it, but for the sake of time, I think we could pretty quickly move on. But basically, I don't think we're talking about unmanaged hunting, which is like, if you're familiar with like Stokes State Forest or Brendan T. Burns State Forest, that's what's happening there. People have to get a hunter safety certification, and that's it. They go out in the woods, and it's legal to go hunt. And but we're talking about very dense, almost urban areas, very densely suburban areas. So really, what we're usually talking about is that managed hunting. It's your local leadership working with park staff, working with us to figure out how we can conduct this safely. Vet hunters, do background checks, the whole 9 yards. So again, with just for the sake of being brief, there's a lot. It probably would surprise most of you, and even you on council, how many regulations we already impose as the state to make sure this is occurring safely. So, to the best of my knowledge, you have a no hunting ordinance or you have a no discharge ordinance already? Okay, so then, well, we already kind of did that for you guys. Anywhere that is within 150 feet from any building, including like a shed, or 450 feet from any school or playground, it's already not allowed from the state's perspective, unless you have permission from the person who owns that shed or the and so on. So unless you have a special permission, this has already actually been largely, the safety aspects have already largely been accounted for. And so the goal, if we were to move forward with some sort of regulated managed hunt, would be to build extra framework around that to be extra sure that you guys, everyone's equally aware of the context for what's happening. So again, there's a number of things that you can do to increase the safety. That's an example of like a safety zone buffer that we can do with our software. I'm sure your township has similar capabilities. We offer signage to help make the public aware so that they know to stay on trails, and really that's the extent of it. We usually recommend safety zones around trails so that hunting's not occurring with anywhere close to a trail. And yeah, I think that this is just basically to show how complicated the regulations get, and it kind of shows how much thought any more urban, suburban municipality that has these programs, which is about, I would say at least about 40 in the state that are similar to you guys, similar enough to you guys, are putting a lot of thought into making sure it's occurring safely. So with that, I'm definitely open to questions.
I'm going to start down with Councilman Weinstein. Just want to preface this again and let everybody know that this council's not taking this matter lightly. We know there's an issue. We know we need to deal with it, and how we deal with it, we're going to discuss that as a council and make recommendations. So let me start down with Councilman Weinstein. See if you have questions for Brian.
Yeah, thanks for the nice presentation. Really appreciate it. Yeah, pretty enlightening. I have some data questions because I'm really not sure where we're kind of at here. So I don't even know, like, do you know how many deers we kind of actually have in this?
Yeah, and as a biologist, I'm supposed to be hesitant to say because we haven't specifically measured it yet. I would not be surprised if you're in the ballpark of 100 deer per square mile. That's typically what we see for areas that have decent enough habitat, are constantly replanting gardens, replanting ornamentals. Typically,
how many are we supposed to sustain though in a square mile?
35 per square mile is on the high end,
So we're
especially on
three times the amount.
at least. That would
Okay.
that would be my professional guess.
Okay.
But it's good to measure it.
And let me just ask you two questions about the lethal part to this. Okay, so one question is on the safety side. How many incidents have there been where there's been some kind of hunt or, in a neighborhood like this where somebody has gotten hurt because of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So in New Jersey, we've never had a non-hunter injured by a hunter. So there have been with firearms, there have been cases of negligence where somebody like shooting a shotgun, not thinking about what's way downrange, and then like maybe a pellet breaks a window or something like that. But in terms of archery for deer management programs, we haven't had those issues. Just to be frank, most of the issues are hunters hurting themselves, climbing up to a tree stand. For those not aware, we would definitely be making the recommendation to be mandating tree stands so that the hunter is elevated and shooting downwards with good visibility. That creates a natural backstop so that projectile is not going sideways, parallel to the ground, it's going downwards. And so again, you have these hunters climbing these stands and sometimes they don't wear their safety harness and they fall. But you should require they wear this.
Just two other questions, then I'll pass it on to somebody else. Well, the other question is, so one thing that you said was, which is a little interesting to me, so let's pretend we get rid of 30 or 60% of the deer. You're basically saying that the neighboring towns we are now going to receive those deer from other towns.
Yeah, so
They're
that's
going to migrate back in.
that is a frustrating dynamic, and it is what makes non-lethal programs unfeasible. It makes a lethal program just a little bit more long-term, I would say. Ultimately, all of these, any population level management is essentially in perpetuity. These animals are reproducing at about 30% annually. So if you stop reducing it by that 30% annually with, adding together deer vehicle collisions, fawns being killed by coyotes, and then the intentional lethal management, that 30% annually needs to be stayed on top of. And that's why we recommend getting to a lower population quickly, and then you're able to maintain it.
But if we do something and Tinton Falls decides not to do something, then we're basically getting Tinton Falls deer.
You will get neighboring deer, and that's why Bergen County is starting, and it seems very promising. They have currently a 13 municipality cooperative that they're engaged with. I will also say that we have presented at your neighboring municipalities, even within my career of about 3.5 years at this point. I've visited your neighboring municipalities, so there's a lot thinking about it. It does take some local leadership. In the case of Bergen County, which essentially we had maybe 70 deer harvested in the entire county annually. Only one municipality was in that situation, and but that local leadership ultimately led to this cooperative.
Okay. Last question: Do we know how many deer? Do we know how many deer have been killed by cars in our town? John, do you know how many deer have been killed?
Yeah, we do.
And I believe the last count when we did the drone flyover, which was several years ago, they had indicated in Playa Park alone there were 300 deer, which was roughly, if I'm not mistaken, 10 times what we should have in there. We should have roughly 30, and we have about 300 right now. And that was years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So that my question would be, before I go to Councilwoman Kaplan, looking at how this has exponentially gotten worse, how bad does it get each and every year, 3, 5 years?
Well, it's a good question, and actually it raises a good ethical question, because without human intervention, and the only natural predator being the occasional coyote, and really people hitting them with their cars. So you're actually relying on the reduced fitness or the lack of health of individual does to be able to breed more, to have higher litter sizes. So when I mentioned fecundity as an option, you're currently exploring that option. by lowering the health of the individual deer. And that's why you would see litter sizes of maybe 1 deer on average in your municipality rather than 2 or 3 when they're healthy. And so, it's an interesting ethical question if that is, best for the individual animal to be sustained like that. So eventually, to answer your question specifically, eventually you would reach some sort of homeostasis between the deer getting hit by cars, the fawns not surviving due
And
to
not
the lack
enough
of the mother's
food-
fitness.
Not enough food left
Exactly.
either, and the fact that Palea Park is getting destroyed.
Precisely.
Right.
So they get more and more desperate. They go from their best nutritional food sources to relying on some of the worst. And we say that winter weakens, but spring kills. Most of the deaths of deer by malnutrition occur in the spring.
So the main thing is to figure out how to get feed the deer.
I would argue that from the individual steer standpoint, they have evolved with predators, and so one of them being humans. Again, like I said, for 14,000 years, humans were a very integral part of deer management in this municipality that we stand.
Jeff, to answer your question, in 22 there were 58 deer by car deaths. Deer by car by deer. Deer by
Deer
car
vehicle
death.
collisions.
There you
call
go. Deaths.
it. Deaths.
20 in,
Of the deer, not people.
of the deer, correct. That's why it was tough to get the way I said it. 22 was 58, Jeff. 23 was 59. In 24, we had a jump to 76.
So we're definitely not in a good spot right now. Anything else,
Oh,
Council?
thank you.
Councilwoman?
Hi, thank you. This
Sure.
was very helpful towards helping us think about this. So just in terms of how it would work, when, where, you explain the how, let's shoot down, okay, but I'm just curious, about some of the
Yeah,
details.
and ultimately it's a longer conversation, but we would recommend beginning any of these endeavors within the confines of our traditional hunting season. So in this area, because of how many deer there are and the limited access, we have extremely liberal hunting regulations so that a few hunters can harvest more deer. So that means your season actually begins in September, mid-September, and extends through mid-February. Now, that's not necessarily what I would recommend doing. Each park, you might have different considerations based on the seasonal usage from park visitors, how large of sections of woodlots that you have between trails, and if you might occasionally want to have park closures to allow some sort of management to occur, say on every Thursday from mid-December to mid-January when the least amount of visitors are there. So apologies, but it's a complicated question, and it just requires planning and forethought and reactive considerations. But we would consult with you guys and help you to figure out what those considerations are.
Okay, and then what happens in your experience when you shoot a deer and there's a loud noise and the rest of them run away? Like, is that a problem? Excuse my
Sure.
naive.
No,
hunting.
it's an extremely valid question, and it's actually one we get pretty frequently. So if you're hunting in a very small woodlot, I would not negate that there is a safety concern with the deer running across the street in reaction. I don't think that's impossible. So I think it's something to consider. But I'm talking less than an acre at that scale. What occurs is that, and this actually gets into the capture myopathy, that unintended death, is that we think of these animals at these fit. I mean, that thing looks crazy fit. But they're actually not extraordinarily fit. So they'll run just far enough away and then they'll turn around and see, what the heck was that noise? And they will often really come back to that exact area to investigate. So it's not like they're running for miles, to help answer your question. They're really running a handful of yards, maybe, in the case of one that was actually the one shot, it's about 100 yards that it would run before it expired. So that's kind of the scale that we're talking.
Okay, and then is it possible to do this during non-daylight hours?
Yeah, that would get into a special permit from us. It's not off the table, but you'd have to apply for, it's called a community-based deer management permit. And basically a community-based deer management permit is if you want anything outside of the traditional hunting season, that's what you're applying for, to give those hunters that special permission. So what I would recommend if you're considering that is to restrict it to probably dawn hours to conduct that for those especially sensitive properties that get a lot of visitation during broader daylight hours. But if you wanted them to hunt at night, you're entering the conversation of professional sharpshooters, and you're kind of exiting the conversation of what a traditional hunter would normally do. You're talking about spotlights, maybe infrared scopes, and it sort of starts to exit, sustenance hunting, the traditional sustenance hunting, and you're starting to talk about, we mandate those deer get donated to the hungry. That's where you're kind of starting to split off from the conversation. But we can explore all of those ideas, certainly if any future talks.
Okay, and then, sorry, I have a lot of questions.
Sure.
What's your experience when there's a neighboring town close to where you're hunting, and what kind of mitigation measures can you take to make sure that the townspeople feel safe or are not scared by loud noises in the middle of the day?
Right, and so archery equipment is not loud, just to start off, so that's not a concern.
Only the archery?
That's our recommendation to begin with. Yeah, certainly, because you don't know, you can't possibly know if that would be enough if you didn't try it exclusively, and that's going to be by far the easiest to implement, because you're no longer talking about a firearm being discharged in a fairly densely populated town. You're talking about archery equipment, which there's probably people shooting archery equipment in their backyard illegally now. So that would be our recommendation to begin with. And I really believe in, like that signage that I showed on the other slide, I really believe in just making the public aware that this is occurring off the trails, and you should just stay on the trails. But these, I'd say that there's also going to be a subset of the population that never feels comfortable with it. And I think that's ultimately any conversation that we have. I think about these safety conversations somewhat similarly to how we generally think about people being allowed to drive cars, is that there's some people that do it very negligently, but we would perform background checks for your permitted hunters. The select few that are allowed to do it have demonstrated safety, demonstrated good ethics, and we can consider them to be more trusted to conduct this activity. Again, it's the difference between what might be occurring in Stokes State Forest versus what we want to occur, next to where our kids play and things like that. But these are ultimately, in all of the parks that are implementing this currently, we're talking Essex County Parks, Union County Parks, both of those with firearms, and Bergen County municipalities, looking at archery only. There's a vast array of examples in New Jersey of these management programs, and it's really just getting past the first year, and then people are used to it. The only reason why we're having this conversation is because it stopped for a period. If it didn't stop, all of these towns in New Jersey and neighboring states where it never stopped, people are just kind of used to it. So, but certainly there's safety precautions that we can take.
And then my last question, you mentioned something about donating the deer.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other creative ideas that you have done in the past, or that you think that we can implement to actually have some positive result out of this exercise?
Absolutely. So that's the easiest one. I will say that it's looking very likely that Monmouth County Parks is going to host a refrigerated trailer for the donation of deer in Turkey Swamp Park, I believe is their county park. So you would actually have your hunters, whoever they may be, if it occurs, would have a very convenient drop-off location relative to what it was previously to get those deer donated. Honestly, you're asking me to be creative. I don't know if I'm going to be that creative on the spot, but I would say that is the biggest thing that you can do beyond all of the safety measures. Would be just seeing that at least if it is available for the sustenance of those volunteers, you're probably going to be asking those select few individuals to be harvesting multiple deer, and after it fills their freezer, if you paid for like about $100 to donate to pay a processor to butcher that deer and then donate it, if you paid for the hunter's deer to do that, that would be a pretty progressive thing that we've seen a bunch of success with. And likewise, I'm almost positive that Monmouth County Parks pays for those deer. Is that correct? Okay. So they turn the revenue from the applications for the hunting, they turn that into the venison donation funds.
Great, thank you. Okay.
Mhm.
That's it for my questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just have one. Great presentation, thank you. And full disclosure, the mayor and I obviously met with you folks a month or so ago. You didn't do this presentation, but you provided us with a lot of information. One of the things that you mentioned tonight, and you mentioned in our meeting, was the Staten Island example, and the fact that it is an island. And yes, there are some deer that do swim there, some that try to get out and swim away too. But you said they spent $7 million, and either of my notes and tonight, I don't see what the actual reduction was.
So yeah, it's
I
complicated.
apologize. And that was on
Yeah.
a non-lethal program.
It's strictly non-lethal.
Right.
So yeah, give a small amount of background. They're doing surgical sterilization of bucks, which already is not recommended. If we were ever going to recommend this practice, we would recommend it on does, because one buck will breed with many does. So if you miss that one buck, you don't sterilize that one buck, it is still breeding with many different does. So real loss of efficacy there. So the numbers they produced show about a 40% decrease after about 8 years or so, I think it's been. So it's something. Certainly it's not nothing. But again, I would urge you to consider that much of that was due to an increase in deer vehicle collisions. So, you reduce the birth rate, but you're still waiting for attrition to actually reduce the population. So they put out kind of odd public statements, I guess I would say, about the success of deer vehicle collisions. But if you look at that first 3 years, it was about 164%. Not about, I did the math. There's a 164% increase in deer vehicle collisions after they started the program. So, but they got that with the $7 million. They did get about a 40% reduction in deer population. Again, aside from the deer vehicle collisions going up, their forest health impacts have actually still gone down somehow. So it's a curious situation, but that's what I can offer on it.
Thank you. That's all I got.
So, the only comment I have really is, obviously, we're affected by, let's say, West Lawn Branch, Tinton Falls, Neptune a bit. It would almost behoove us, before we even consider any decision, that we have the discussion with the neighboring municipalities, because, if we were to ever consider this, it would definitely, I don't know if it would work based on what you're saying, that we would take care of some of the problem, and then we would probably have more of a problem down the line if they would come over the border, because they're not going to follow residency requirements.
Yeah, and I should preface that by saying that's a tremendous impact. That's a tremendous issue with the non-lethal approaches. But we have many examples where the immigration rates were significantly below the cull rates, or however you want to describe the lethal management rates. So despite the surroundings, we did see those positive results. And I would also just urge you to consider that while I 100% agree with the approach of looping in as many neighboring stakeholders, Monmouth County Parks potentially has properties that are currently unmanaged, and they would be very happy to include. Monmouth County Parks harvests about 700, I believe, annually in their programs. So an extremely successful deer management program coming out of Monmouth County Parks. And RJ would be a good person. Their natural resources guy would be a good person to consult with. Getting a second opinion.
If Ocean did make a move on it, I'm pretty sure that they would, the county would go into Wells Park in a heartbeat.
Mhm.
I mean, I think they're waiting for us to kind of make a move, but obviously everybody up here is apprehensive. I
Right.
mean, none of us. I mean, they're beautiful creatures. I mean, you can't argue the fact that they're beautiful animals, but we also know there's a problem, and we have to grapple with this as a council and make a decision because, I mean, obviously it's getting worse and worse and worse. Our parks, property homeowners, getting destroyed. Gardens, plants, arborvitaes, you name it, it gets eaten. So, it's a tough decision for us up here. And I want everybody to understand that this is not one that's taken lightly, and it's definitely one that's probably the most difficult issue that I think as a council we've ever had to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you allowed me to expand on my thoughts on that issue with immigration being something that's confounding and challenging, I would also just urge you to consider that when you let's say remove only 15 deer from the municipality on your first year, that would, from a population level standpoint, that would probably not cut it for even a short-term visible reduction. However, it may feel bad that you put in that little bit of effort, or even maybe a decent amount of effort, and you're not seeing drastic results. But that is a deer that is not getting hit by a car, so that's not changing someone's outcome. It is not going to be hosting ticks. It's not, and considering it a little bit more broadly, getting into a little bit more complicated ways we think about it. But again, those deer are leaving those neighboring municipalities because they need somewhere to live. And so it's not as though it's not even it's a positive for the deer themselves. So it's frustrating. I would certainly say that if you're in the center, you make your own little island of doing what I would consider the right thing, and your neighbors are not doing the right thing. But I think historically, as Americans, we don't really, we'd rather be the ones doing the right thing. I generally think. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't, carefully consider these decisions. And I think the way you're thinking about it is logical and practical. But I do think that they're, even in what I would consider are probably not super successful from a population level standpoint, I think you're going to see some small impacts, however little. And it would provide you that room to grow. And again, in the case of Bergen County, Saddle River Township borough, only boroughs up there, Saddle River has been doing their own program on their little island in the middle of Bergen County for about 4 years now, I think. And finally, after some help from us giving these presentations up there, now they have that 13 municipality cooperative. So honestly, some municipalities, their council doesn't even want to start the conversation because they're thinking about their elections the next year. So it is really noble that you guys are approaching this complicated, really, value-based discussion to begin with. And it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world from my perspective if you became local leaders on the subject. So that would be my response.
Thank you.
Sure.
With that being said, I'm going to open it up to the public for any questions, comments, concerns. If you do step up to the microphone, state your name and address for the record. Please understand there's a 3-minute limit. And if you have any comments, questions for Brian, please express what you want to express, and then he'll answer whatever question you have.
Here, would you like?
Hi, Tricia Donovan, Delaware Avenue in Oakhurst. So you said that the county's waiting for us to do something?
They won't touch Wells Park unless Ocean Township does something.
And why is that? Wouldn't that be like the perfect solution, to let them try it out over there and kind of alleviate the responsibility of the council to implement?
I think that's a great idea.
Great point, Trish.
Maybe we'll make a call tomorrow.
Because they hunt all over
It's
the
an election
county.
year.
Yeah, that's right.
Like Brian said, it's an election year.
Every year it's an election year for them. Trish,
Okay.
we could, Trish, that's a good point. I mean, we have, all of us have a very good relationship with the board, with the commissioner board, the county. So, I mean, I don't have a problem reaching out, and I'm sure Rob doesn't either, so.
And it's not like they are not doing it. Not like this would be a totally new program for them. I have a
Brian,
question.
have they indicated why they won't touch welts without us doing anything?
It is a burden for their park rangers to have small islands of, pretty important management activities occurring. They would want to be able to check those hunters, have the proper permits from the county and from us, and having those rangers get sent out more often at early hours, late hours, without you guys already being involved with it, without your municipality residents already being used to it. This sort of question is happening all over the place. And I will also add a little bit of biological complexity to this discussion with that recommendation, is that deer in suburban habitats have a home range of, on average, about 1/10 of a square mile. So if you only had one little island of management activity occurring in that one small park, your municipality is much larger than 1/10 of a square mile. And so you have a lot of does breeding without any impact from these management activities occurring all around. And so if you're talking about that island effect that was already concerning to you, again, something is better than nothing, but now you're really talking about something quite close to nothing. It maybe will help that park alone. But again, just something to consider that, when you're taking these approaches, you are looking for more areas to reach more of these resident deer.
But it would be a trial. You would see how everybody reacts and what, they would get used to, what the ramifications would be or wouldn't be. And I have a question for you on the permitting for the lethal management. Do you allow the hunters to take a deer, or everything has to be given to a food bank or?
No, so we refer to these as bag limits. A normal licensed hunter in New Jersey, let's just say in this area, they're actually allotted unlimited antlerless deer. So we don't even put a limit on the number of does that a hunter can harvest. Pardon? No. Sorry. And they're allowed a handful of bucks because we're trying to urge these hunters to harvest multiple does to impact that population. So all of those deer, they would be able to bring home, and that would be normal. It would be the exception for them to certainly be forced to donate it. That's not normal in these programs. You want some incentive structure. They're already paying a fee. And what they get is to feed their family from locally sourced meat. So, yeah.
Anyone else wishing to be heard? Before you step up, Brian, real quick, is there a cost to the municipality if this is decided?
No, I mean, ultimately cost depends on how much of that control that you want. So a lot of municipalities, once it's instituted, you've done all of these planning processes. It's actually bringing in a small amount of money, very nominal amount. But a lot of municipalities charge between $75 and $100 for the application fee. And again, we would recommend that you turn that back into offering to pay for the donation of these deer.
Okay.
But now if you want to do annual drone surveys, if you want to do park closures where you're starting to talk about PD having to get involved. So again, I would say money and control are tightly associated.
Good. Our former councilman, John Huss. Hello there, Mr. Huss.
Hi, how you doing? A couple of things. In fact, Tracy,
He's underneath the speaker.
one of the biggest problems I have is not so much the deer. What do we do with the Canada geese? How do you get rid of them? You're talking about geese, the deer. And deer, I have probably, I think I counted 52 plants over the 3 years that I've been in the manor. I have lost none to a deer. None. Now, if I don't lose them, what I'm planting, plant something that the deer won't eat. And then we're looking 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. What have we got? Less than 10 people here? Is this deer management a terrible thing? I mean, if we had 100 people here, maybe I could listen. But I can't listen to, 10 people? It doesn't make any sense. And then if you put a rifle shotgun in somebody's hand in my backyard, I don't think he's going to make it. You know, I don't, but you can't. You know, if there's an accident for one of those, the township is responsible, and you're going to end up paying the insurance on it. Yeah, and I don't think you want to do that. And lastly, as far as Welch is concerned, somehow the county got their nose into the Welch tract. Well, the Welch tract was purchased by the county through a conservation program. The conservation program sat with Sam Welch in my arms with tears in his eyes, with his wife Louise being honored by that Welch tract, and said it's going to be beautiful, and I can just manage picture walking through the trails, with Louise, and the deer would just look at me and smile. And if Welch tract has some deer, I don't think you're allowed to touch them. To tell you the truth, if you look at the conservation easement on that thing. And I don't think I don't think your Welch tract is in that. You just can't do it. I don't know. My mind used to be up here and still up here. It's tough coming out. That's all.
Sounds great.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. Thank you.
Anyone else wishing to be heard? Please state your name and address for the record.
Hi, I'm Luz Benowan, and I'm from
You want this? Why don't you
Colonial
come over here, where the stand is.
from Colonial Terrace. As a medical person, I'm also worried about the health of the kids, especially when they're in the playground. Because aside from a medical person, I'm also a mom who has a son who had a tick-borne disease that affected half of his body. So I'm wondering if you guys have a data about tick-borne diseases from affected by deer tick, and also probably if we have information about increase in tick-borne diseases, maybe there would be an increased participation of other township, because that's also health concern.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you start to talk about tick-borne diseases, you're starting to look at pretty broad things that are difficult to study just in nature. So here's what I can speak to on it, is that it's actually the black-legged tick that transmits Lyme's disease. And the life cycle of Lyme's disease is that it's actually a young tick will first feed on a mouse, and that's the required host for Lyme's disease, where the tick receives it from a mouse. So you're already talking about multiple species. Then it will go on to, when it goes through several nymph stages as an adult, it will then latch on to a larger mammal to get the blood meal to produce young and offspring. So in actuality, it's the tick population itself, not specifically Lyme's disease, that is so closely linked to deer. And so studies have found that when you reduce deer populations, the density of ticks decline. But you're starting to get into third order interactions when it comes to specifically the number of Lyme's disease cases. Now, if we also think about why that might be complicated. Me as an outdoors person, I'm not just going in my backyard to be outside. I'm going bird watching in the local park. I'm going 2 hours south to go bird watching or something. And so it's also difficult to say the specific locality where a person got that tick on them. You know, I've pulled like 15 ticks off of me that are bitten in the last couple weeks. So some people are just higher risk users for that stuff. But what is known has been observed multiple times, like several times in exhaustive studies, is that black-legged tick populations, which transmit Lyme's disease, are very closely related to deer populations. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes.
It's, you know, you have to actually detect Lyme's disease. My ex-girlfriend, half of her face was paralyzed because of Lyme's disease, Bell's palsy. Whereas other people may not see any symptoms of it for years, and so it's not always necessarily even detected. So it can be a challenging disease to study, and again, often life-altering ramifications from it. But hopefully if that makes sense to everybody.
Thank you, Brian.
Sure.
Anyone else wishing to be heard?
Hi, Katie Williams, Franklin Parkway. Didn't we have this on the ballot a couple years ago?
Yes.
And we didn't do anything because it was 50-50? Is that kind of why nothing was happened?
The wording on the ballot was a bit confusing, and the answer that we got back was even more confusing as to what was decided. I mean, I don't have that ballot question in front of me, but the way that it came out, it was, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it was a bit convoluted the way that the question was written.
Okay.
That's another consideration. We could do another question as a referendum that's way more clear than it was last time.
That was my second question. Would you, the council, take on this
Would
by
we
saying
consider
yes
that
or
again?
no, or would you put it back on the ballot?
I don't have a problem with it. I mean, but I would run it past our colleagues. I mean,
Right.
you know, there's 5 of us up here, and you know, if we decide as a group that that's the way to go, I personally, my opinion is, yeah, we do another question on the ballot.
Right.
Sorry,
Okay.
Jesse.
I would also caution, and I'm not sure a way around this, but you guys, how many people are here? 10 that heard the pros and cons of the different options. When you see it on a ballot, you know, I might always say I'd rather, you know, like some birth control measure. But if you're telling me it doesn't work,
Right.
then
This was very informative. I mean, it didn't change my personal opinion, but it's also, you're right, how much information can you put on the ballot so somebody understands that it's a bow and arrow, they're going to be in the top,
Right,
they're going to be
exactly.
shooting down. Nobody's going to hear that.
The way
So,
that
right, I don't know if that's the right thing either.
The way that it was worded that yes, no, or hybrid. And when we couldn't figure out if
Right.
the hybrid meant that they wanted to kill the deer or not kill the deer. So that's why I think that the wording of that question on the ballot was confusing. And if we do another question on the ballot, we need to make it way more clear and concise.
That, and I think, like Gita said, there needs to be context behind it so people
Yep.
really understand
Yep.
the difference.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, agreed.
Thank you.
Thank you for your input.
Can I just add one comment
Yes.
to that, Katie? The answer to the first part of the question is yes. The ballot question had it was challenging. We also didn't not act. We continued to try to do something, and whether it was the state or whether it was the county, as we were putting applications in, needing to do studies, gather more information, we've been literally at this up until 5 months ago.
All 4 years I've been
Well, all 4 years he's been there, but we've been at I've been on the council 10 years. We've been discussing it since then. But Mr. Brown and Tracy have been putting applications in up until I think we stopped 4 months ago, 5 months? About that.
There was some information missing on the applications that went into the state that the council was not aware of either.
Applications for what?
When you put in the application to the state to ask them if they would approve a hybrid model, and when it was put in there, not by Manager Brown, but a former manager, There was some information that was missing, and unfortunately, the council was not aware of that. So, as we were waiting for the information, we didn't know why we weren't getting an answer, and the answer really was it was missing some information. Now we know. And then that's why we're here now. Yep. Anyone else? Any other questions in regard to the deer? Okay, Brian, thank you and your team. We appreciate that. Excellent presentation. Thank you very much. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.